Hello, a warm welcome. I am Felicity Ezewike. African Union's Agenda 2063 envisions a peaceful, prosperous, and globally competitive Africa. It advocates for projects focusing on infrastructure, trade, and empowerment of youth and women. And just like many regional initiatives, it also emphasizes cross-border integration and development. The vision of a borderless Africa is one of unity and shared prosperity for the continent. It is rooted in the ideals of the Pan-Africanist movement. There are contradictions, however, between those ideals and the realities of governance on the continent. A postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Johannesburg, Tinashe Sithole, writes that internal divisions, structural poverty, poor governance, and competing national interests have undermined Pan-Africanism over the decades. But there remains an unquenchable desire to achieve an Africa where Africans can move around their continent without the current restrictions in place for better trade, integration, and development. So we're exploring his submissions today on how to bridge the gap between the ideals and practice of Pan-Africanism towards a borderless Africa. That is the premise for today's conversation, I beg your pardon. And my guests are Dr. David Matsanga. He's a familiar face on this channel, Africa Affairs analyst. He joins us from Dar es Salaam. We also have Dr. Louis George Steen. He's the Prime Minister, State of the African Diaspora, and he joins us from Paris. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome you to one slot. I'll start with you, Dr. Steen. Pan-Africanism at its peak was seen as the necessary philosophy around which all people of African descent should unite to develop strategies against racial injustice, inequality, and ending colonialism in Africa. Some would say colonialism has been kicked out of the continent, but that is also debatable. The question, though, is it still a relevant movement today?
Well, I would say so, because that was the dream of our ancestors. We all remember that when the African Union in 1963 was about to be created, in fact, there were two options. One of them brought to the table by Kwame Nkrumah, it was about creating the United States of Africa. Mm-hmm. And the other one, unfortunately, was actually supported by some Francophone countries. Probably France was behind, and they said, we don't want to create that. Every single country would be its own country. So, of course, it was impossible to do the United States of Africa without the Francophone area. So they said, okay, we're going to just create, national countries, and we will have a kind of weak entity. We will create that with some name. And the dream was lost for a few generations. But now we actually need to revive that ambition, because it's only that way that Africa will liberate itself totally. Colonialism, as you said, is still there. When you suggested, it's still there, as we know. So we need to be united, not only all the continents of the diaspora, or the countries in the continent, but also the diaspora. So when you say a borderless state, that should also include the diaspora, of course.
Okay, I mean, we have to get the African continent to be borderless. When we talk about those who are already outside of the country, it goes without saying that when they come into the continent, they access that. But I would like to explore your thoughts on that subsequently. Let me go to Dr. Matsanga and just ask, I mean, a lot of ideas have gone into, growth for Africa and integration. So I'd love you to paint us a picture. How would a more integrated Africa impact regional trade, for instance, investment and economic development? Okay, you need to check your device if it is muted.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay,
thank you very much for inviting me. Pan-Africanism still exists. It is there, we have it amongst ourselves. Some of us who were there when this organization We found it from, it was formed when we were seeing. We still believe it can work. But from inception, as my colleague has said, there was a problem.
Okay, Dr. Matsanga, let me interject, because Dr. Teen has established the Pan-Africanism and, the fact that it has to be revived. My question to you, though, is to paint us a picture of what an Africa, let's dream a little before we continue this conversation. What an Africa that is truly integrated and has, easy communication, how will it how will it influence regional trade and promote economic development?
Thank you very much. If we dream ahead, if we had an integrated Africa, free movement, free customs, no visas, this continent would provide quite a lot of jobs, employment, facilities, good health facilities. Going to a hospital in South Africa would not require visas and documents. Going to Nigeria, you don't need visas. It would be a great nation, a great one continent, if we had no barriers. But the barriers would have caused us all the trouble we see today. The barriers are not only on land, Felicity. The barriers are also in air. When you want to go to Equatorial Guinea, you have to go to where my friend is, in Paris. Before you come down, you take 3 days to travel to Africa. You want to go to Senegal, you have to pass through Paris. The intertrade has not worked. If you want to sell goods from Kenya to Uganda, from Uganda to Dar es Salaam, from Dar es Salaam to Nigeria, if you want to export goods, you have to go through a lot of tariffs in order to be. So if we had been integrated, we would look the best people, and it would be the best continent, with strength, with enough to eradicate poverty, disease, ignorance that we see still lingers amongst the African continent. That's why they still use these words, development, developing world. These words have been used for many years. But later on, as we discuss, you'll see what are the obstacles that have caused us to break, which you might be the second question or wherever you are going. But okay. For me, a dream, a good Africa, would be an Africa where I get into a plane, I arrive in Ghana, for example, one of the countries that has opened the doors for every African. I'm not a criminal, nobody's a criminal. You arrive, they take your passport, you tell them, I have come here for a holiday. Why do we spend time to go to holiday in Europe, yet we can go to holiday in
Great.
Ghana? Why should I not go?
Yes. Yes. I just wanted us to envisage how it would look like. And to be fair to leaders that have come and gone, efforts have been made, ideas have been brought to life. And one of those ideas was an African continental free trade area. We have worked. People keep saying that Africa cannot come up with something, but we have worked, and that has come to life, no matter how flawed is it. So I want to come back to you, Dr. Team, and have you talked to us about how the concept of Africa without borders interacts with this idea that came to life, the Africa Free Trade Area, and how this, this effort that brought about this free trade area might influence our quest for a borderless Africa?
It's obvious that the free trade area is something very important. The second step is actually to build transport system all over the continent, because as our colleague was saying, today it would cost less money to import food from the United States or from Europe rather than from our neighbors. So yes, the barriers are now removed to some extent, but what about the transport system? Do we have a railway, for example? We could certainly create a railway all along the shores of Africa. That's something we are working on at the moment, by the way, because it doesn't mean anything if you say, yes, the barriers, now are history, which is not true, but to some extent. But there is no way actually to go from one place to another one. So transport is the next step to be done. And that way, instead of buying food or any other resources from outside, we would be able to buy from our neighbors and sell to our neighbors so that the money remains on the continent. That's something quite important to promote.
Dr. Matsanga, it would be lovely if it is as easy as that. Just put all the roads and we will get things moving. But we know, like you rightly pointed out earlier, Dr. Teen, that the United States of Africa did not work for many reasons. So, Dr. Matsanga, how does an Africa without border work in practice, considering the individuality and nationalistic tendencies of African countries?
Thank you very much for that question. And that question has come across in courts. For example, let me give you a very good example. We have an African Court of Justice in Banjul. We have another African Court of Justice and the Human Rights People and the Human Rights Court in Tanzania, Arusha. My dear sister, out of 54 countries, 55 countries, only 40 have signed and handed. Only 8 countries have signed and handed over their instruments to be charged by human rights organizations. I will shock you that most of the big countries in Africa, Egypt, Ghana, Egypt, Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, they have not signed this treaty. The only smaller countries that have signed is Burkina Faso in West Africa, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, Botswana, in the court. And yet this is a court we wanted to say, we don't want our people to be shipped in Europe to be tried in the ICC once they have made a mistake on African continent. Let's go to the trade, which my brother has talked about. Out of 55 countries that signed this agreement in Kigali, only 44 so far, 44. And out of the 44, very few have ratified it. So it is always an obstacle. And as I will tell you, the obstacle comes from internal dynamics. Some countries are too nationalistic. Some of them don't want to lose their shape. Some of them have nothing to tell us. Some of them are not even patriotic to themselves. They rely on foreign countries that come to tell them, don't sign. We shall look after you. We shall, if you go into this group, this will happen. I have attended all AU summits since 1985. I've been going for these summits. And I've been attending, I've been seeing lots of things there. So what are the obstacles that we face? One of the obstacles is we are not honest to each other. No country. For example, a Nigerian person to go to South Africa, you need to carry documents of this nature. Nigerian food to be sold in South Africa, you need a lot of certificates. And look, why should we do that? There are still a lot of obstacles, Felicity, which are on our way. And we might not overcome this obstacle. Then comes a big monster for us. The biggest monster are the external forces that don't want Africa to have any unity at all. One bloc will come and say, China, don't worry, I will give you whatever you want. Another bloc said, Paris, especially French, where Mr. Tini is, said, no, don't worry. We don't join those people. Those are not good people. And then they bring in divisions. We have lots of divisions, Felicity. If you go to AU, madam, you will pick your microphone and go out. If there is any decision in the AU to vote, they don't vote as Africans. They vote as French speakers, and they vote as English speakers.
Dr. Matsanga, I'd like to, I'm triggered when we talk about these external factors that are working against African unity. So I'm going to come back to you, but I want to go to Dr. Tim and, go back to your earlier submission on the need to expand our transportation network, infrastructure through trains and all of that. I know it takes some real work, but I think it's fair to let you expand your thoughts on that. I kind of cut you short a bit.
Yes. When we think of the United States of America, for example, it is obvious that one of the mechanisms they used to expand was actually through the railway. And they used that even to colonize, which is another story. But they couldn't actually develop the country without this mechanism, which is the railway. So that's something very basic. So of course, food is also important, and we have a program for food. But if you cannot transport the food from one place to another one, there's no way how you could possibly develop your country. So to have these, of course, these mechanisms, the free trade agreement is one thing. To have transport is even better. So I believe Pan-African is stronger now than it used to be perhaps 30 or 50 years ago. Today, do we know that Africa is in fact almost as powerful as India? People don't know that, but because we look at ourselves as small, poor countries, well, that may be so individually, but that's the same thing also in India, after all. After all, India looks like a group of poor states, but together they are a very strong economy. So instead of speaking of Mali, Burundi, Congo, and Nigeria, we should speak of Africa. And if you make the calculation, the GDP of Africa, you will find out it's actually almost the fifth, depending on the way how you make your calculation, but it's already the fourth or the fifth economy in the world.
Dr. Tin,
change the narrative.
Please don't lose your train of thought, but I needed to interject and ask, when you talk about not looking at things from, Nigeria, Burundi, or any other country, but as Africa, you seem not to take seriously the aspect about individuality, which I brought up earlier. So, agreed. I agree completely with you that Pan-Africanism has grown. But in real terms, how can we get away from our individualistic tendencies enough to look at the holistic picture for the continent's growth?
Well, it's a debate we need to have on the continent. Because many people will tell you, yes, Kwame Nkrumah did dream about that, but that's history. Well, that's also our future. So we need to have a debate about that. I think it's high time we revisit the constitution of the African Union. Some people may disagree. I believe many people may also agree. I even think there is a majority in the population about that. It's just that we don't take it seriously. So we think, yes, of course I agree, but it will never happen. Perhaps in 4, 5, 10 generations it will. Well, if we all agree, why don't we make it?
Yeah, but we had an organization before we had the African Union. I think that was OAU. And we've had some pockets of sub-regional bodies as well. But if you look at it continent-wise, some argue that the same challenges that plagued the OAU and is now defunct is the same challenge that is plaguing the African Union, that individualism again, ego and all those issues come up to impede our efforts at growth. And I mean, we also talked at some point, there was a talk about single currency for the African continent. That didn't come to light. But again, we fall back to the African free trade area and, the impact that it is currently making. There is some optimism there, but how can we work despite, it's enough to say we agree, but is there perhaps mechanism, bodies that can, or emboldening efforts for the African Union to be more active on the continent?
Well, there's something very interesting. It's just a detail, but you would notice that more and more ministers of foreign affairs of Africa are ministers of foreign affairs, diaspora, and integration. So integration is part of their mandate. That's a small thing, but that's a very interesting signal. Now, we don't need to go through the nations. We already have the regions. Let us not forget that level, that scale. So we could actually organize a coalition of the regions. Well, North Africa as a region does not really exist, but at least we have all the other regions plus the diaspora. So we could organize a coalition of regions. It's a matter of will. Do we will it or not? But we don't need actually to unite 54 countries. We could unite 4, 5, 6 regions. My task as the Prime Minister of the State of the African Diaspora, which represents the 6th region, is also to encourage these discussions. I cannot tell you everything, of course, because something needs to remain, secret so far, but that's something we are working on, and I think that it's possible. Europe, in fact, was totally destroyed after the Second World War, and it would have been impossible to work with Germany and France, for example. They were enemies. But they said, okay, we're going to work just on agriculture and, transport. So it was very technical. They said, we all need to have transport. We all need to have agriculture. So let's do something together. Gradually, they expanded the program. They said, we'll need to have a little bit of governance around. And this is how they finally created the European Union. If I can compare the European Union and the African Union, I would say the difference is striking. The European Union is very strong in terms of governance, but very weak in terms of feeling. If you ask somebody from Spain, what do you have in common? Even with your neighbor of Portugal, they would say, I don't have anything in common with them. Not even to mention with Poland, Italy, or any, they don't care. So the European feeling is very, very low. In Africa, it's the opposite. The African institutions are weak, but the African feeling is very strong. If you ask your neighbors, do you have a map of Africa at home? Of course they have one. On a t-shirt, on a mug, as a jewel, in our songs, we all have Africa everywhere in our lives. You wouldn't see that in Europe. So that is a strong foundation. So we don't have the institutions, but we have a feeling. And I think for the future, that is more than important. We have in our heart, even when people are enemies with their neighbor, that's okay. But they're all Africans and want to portray themselves as Africans. So that is a very strong foundation for the borderless states you are talking about.
Fair enough. I mean, we have to start somewhere. Dr. Matsanga, I want you to go back to your submission on the influence of external forces against Africa unity. That seems to come up a lot. But we've had this external influence over the decades, but somehow, like the optimistic tone that Dr. Teen is putting forward, Africa has been able to achieve certain milestones in spite of that. Do you think it is still as strong as it was years back? You mentioned China and other countries.
Yes, thank you very much. Sorry for the hiccup, but I am back. Let me tell you frankly, if external influence is real still available, we only got political independence. We did not get economic independence. Most of the states in West Africa, for example, all the French-speaking countries, they got only political independence to have flags. We have flags, but we don't have money in the pocket. Money was not coming to us. Money was going somewhere, then given to us. At least for us in the English-speaking states like Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, and those Anglophone, we had that both. We were left with both. We were given, okay, go ahead. But we started mismanaging our own economies. That's okay. But most of the Francophone states in Africa had no economic independence. So economic independence is the key that makes a country work. You can have politics, but that politics is again determined by the external forces. Look at ECOWAS. ECOWAS has no money of its own. ECOWAS is built by the European Union. You see us begging European Union to be given money in order to run our projects in ECOWAS, in East African Community, in African Union itself. So we have quite a lot of problems to sort out as far as neo-colonialism is concerned. China builds
While His Excellency is speaking about ECOWAS, could I give an example,
yes,
a very interesting example?
Go ahead.
Yes. One of the best examples showing the force.
Dr. Matsanga, just hold on a minute. He wanted to interject so he doesn't forget his thought. We'll come back to you, please.
Yes. A very important example that nobody noticed. You remember 2 years ago, France was about to start a war against Niger, and ECOWAS was even supporting that to some extent. What happened? There was a meeting of the Security Council of the African Union. Most people didn't even know something like that would exist. They said it's not acceptable that France or anybody else would make a war against any of our countries. And they said, we want a unanimous vote because we don't want any country of Africa to then give access to France and say, oh, okay, we came because we were invited by XYZ. No, they said, we want not only a majority, but a unanimous vote.
Okay.
Therefore, in fact, the war never started. And that's quite an achievement. It's invisible because, of course, a war that does not happen is invisible. But that's quite a victory. And I think that's a stone, a very important for the future. For the first time ever, Africa was not even able to defeat somebody.
All right, Dr. Chin, we interjected Dr. Matsanga.
Which is even better.
We interrupted Dr. Matsanga to let you interject. So, Dr. Matsanga, sorry for the interjection, but he needed to add something to what you were saying.
Yes, that is a good one, but still, we borrow their money. We borrow money for elections. Felicity, let's be frank, my brother here, let's talk frankly as African. It is good you are in the diaspora. We borrow money from these people to hold our election. Then when they come to account, they say, how did you spend the money for this election? You start crying. Africa needs to do one thing, to throw out completely this neo-colonialism. That tag that comes through the back window, the ventilator. We have closed it in the main door, but in the back window, it's still coming. Not only the European Union, America, for example. Look at this situation, Felicity. At the moment, Trump wants to chase everybody out of his America. Nobody is speaking at all. My brother there is in Paris. He hasn't issued a statement against it. AU itself has not even said something. Many Africans are being loaded on the plane. They're about to come. Now, let's be honest. What can we do to change this neo-colonialism? Look at the question of the visa.
Dr. Matsanga.
There are so many things that if I was a president on Africa, Palestine, wait a minute. There are certain things I will change. There are certain things I will change. You know what? Why should an American pay $50 to come and see Nigeria? When you want to go to US, you have to pay $300 for a visa. And even the money at times doesn't come back. We have a lot. God created us differently. And let's begin with that spirit. My friend in Paris, we must educate our people that neo-colonialism is the biggest obstacle that comes to divide us every time we want to unite.
I mean, if we bring in Trump's moves now, we won't leave this place, and we're trying to focus on, within our own borders, and there are mixed feelings about his policies, but let's leave that for another day. There is a part of your submission, though, that I want to flip on its head. You talked about the fact that some African countries don't have economic independence, and this is one way that we still have colonialism being somehow practiced on the continent. But shouldn't the fact that there are concerns about economic independence be a booster for a borderless Africa that will allow free movement of trade?
That's okay. Which booster? For example, you want to export, you try to export your pepper, pili-pili, which we call PPL in East Africa, paper to Europe. They will want you to design the box, to design how this paper should look like. You see, how does that help African countries to grow economically? You have tariffs that have been put on our goods. Some of our goods go into Europe with high tariffs. And that is, I saw it in the European Union when East Africa wanted to join, when Britain cut off from the European Union. We remained on our own as Commonwealth countries. So Britain came on its own, we shall buy your goods. But the European Union said, we need this, that, before you even export commodities to go into Europe, you must go under through a lot of difficulties. So there is nothing that they have given us which encourages us to even go. If we want to have a free trade area, European Union with a population like East African community, we have a population like, let's say ECOWAS, where you are. You have a population of about 700 million people coming together. It will threaten Europe, and Europe will come in. That is an external threat. It will come in to say, oh, this one is short, this one is tall, take this one out. That is what they do. Colonial doctrine of mercantile capitalism has destroyed our continent. They still have the Captain Lugard, doctrine of our land, our wealth, and our people. Now we are even exporting our own people. They want our people. You have seen a lot. 10,000 Nigerians are stranded somewhere in Thailand. Another several in the Middle East. Another one. That type must be corrected by Africa.
All right.
And Africa has not put there the correction systems so that our people stay here on the continent.
I think this is a good point for us to take a very short break. And when we come back, Dr. Tina, I'll be asking you about concerns about uneven benefits of borderless Africa for some countries. Stay with us. Glad you're still with us. We're still looking at the possibilities for a borderless Africa for better integration and economic growth. We still have my guest, Dr. Teen and Dr. Matsanga, speaking on this subject matter. Before we went on the break, I did say, Dr. Teen, I was going to come to you about uneven benefits. There are concerns about unequal resource distribution. There are concerns about corruption and weak infrastructure hindering broader progress to expand trade networks and strengthen regional trade. What is your thinking about these concerns and how we can untie the knots?
Well, I agree that these concerns are serious. I would say that probably the most serious concern at this stage is climate change. We don't need to explain why it's so, of course, threatening for us. We are already the hottest continent in the world. So, of course, global warming will affect us more than anybody else. So far, Africa is contributing only to 5% of climate change, but 2/3 of the climate disasters are already happening in Africa. So floods everywhere, thousands of people dying in Malawi, in Chad or Nigeria, etc. So that's why we need to work on climate justice. It means that the people who did actually cause these problems, these disasters, should be the one paying. And I'm glad to say that the state of the African diaspora has signed several cooperation agreements with international funders to bring climate justice, which means funds for the countries of Africa. So if we can actually overcome this problem, I believe prosperity can come to the continent. Even corruption cannot stop that because the growth is already there. The population is young. So naturally, it's going to improve even in spite of all of that. But climate change is the main danger. And if we don't take it seriously, of course, we're going to be destroyed through wars, floods, and other disasters.
Climate change is just one of the many aspects and concerns of
it's the worst.
Yeah. So, sorry?
But believe me, it's the worst.
Okay, but beyond
than all the other obstacles.
Okay, beyond climate change, though, I did mention uneven distribution of resources. Smaller countries might be worried about being swallowed by more stronger economies on the continent. And that's an aspect I'd like you to quickly speak on.
Well, that's true. For example, in ECOWAS, of course, the presence of France was an obstacle. But there is another one internally. Some smaller countries would say, we don't want this currency, the ECO, because we're going to be swallowed by Nigeria. And I can understand that. But so the problem was not a technical problem. It was not even a financial problem. It was more a psychological problem. I discussed with some presidents of ECOWAS. They said, we don't want to go from French domination to Nigerian domination. But in a way, this is perhaps where the diaspora can play a role, because we are neutral. We are not supposed to be running for Nigeria over Benin over Mali, or Mali over anybody else. We are actually connected to every single country of Africa. We are the Switzerland, if you like, of Africa. So we are in a good place to play this role, this pivotal role in Africa, and that's why we are working on this particular matter.
Okay, I think it's a good time to ask you to expand on your earlier submission about including the diaspora in a borderless Africa. Could you talk to us about what role you see the diaspora really playing in practical solutions to enhance the pursuit of a borderless Africa?
Yes, let me go back, for example, to the figures provided by the World Bank. According to them, the diaspora sends to the continent each year $70 billion, which is twice as much as the so-called economic aid. That represents 13% of the GDP of Senegal, 26% of the GDP of Liberia, or 70% of the GDP of Sudan. It's not small money. That could be even increased because the people who send money are only the migrants. For example, a migrant from Congo will send money to his family. But the historic diaspora, the people whose ancestors were deported as slaves, they are much more numerous. They have more financial resources. So according to my estimations, in 20 years, we could move from $70 billion every year to $1,000 billion every year. And already the African diaspora is 40% of the GDP of the continent. So if we could reconnect all of that, if we could create channel for investment, because yes, the migrant would send money to their family, that's normal, but the historic, the Black American, the Black people from Brazil, they would like to contribute as well, but where? They're not going to send money to Mozambique or to Congo or Nigeria. They need to have a special vehicle to invest. So if you have these mechanisms sitting in the African Union or with the African Union, whatever the mechanism, they could then, of course, reinforce what actually Africa is trying to achieve. So that's very practical because when you have so much money, then you can do all the development you need and you don't depend on your enemies.
Okay.
So far, Africa is organizing the Africa-France Summit, Africa-China, Africa-Russia. That's fine. But myself, when I am ill, I would rather ask support from my family rather than from my enemies or former enemies or future enemies, I don't know. So Africa should work with family, and family is diaspora.
All right, Dr. Matsanga, what's your thinking on his submission about the role of the diaspora in working with governments across Africa to improve our quest for, easier movement and trade? Dr. Matsanga, can you hear me?
Most of the economies of Africa today, Felicity, depend on foreign funding, diaspora funding. Let's say Uganda, for example, is 60% of our money now comes from foreign diaspora. The people who are in London, the people who are in America, the people who are in the Middle East. The diaspora is huge. Some went as refugees, some went as economic workers. There's a lot of money coming out from the diaspora. But the point we have here, which my brother here must know, and a critical point that can unite Africa first, language. We have a very serious barrier, language barrier, and the AU has to try to do something so that we talk with one language. Why has the English colonized or conquered almost everywhere in the world? In language, we have Swahili, for example, Swahili, Felicity. There are very few people in Africa, when you say Swahili, they say, what are you talking about? We have not done enough to inculcate our own patriotism of our own language. The French came with the language. The Portuguese came with the language. The British came with the language. What has Africa? Chinese are now coming with the language. There are so many people learning Chinese, black people. By in 20 years to come, Chinese will be one of the formidable languages on the African continent. So why are we not using our language as a form, a vehicle to make ourselves recognized and respected? Then we come to what we call the big elephant.
Dr. Matsanga, I mean, I have to play the devil's advocate at some point here. When you talk about using our language, we're not talking about one country. We're talking about Africa-wide. And if you look at it, colonialism left behind certain things, and one of those is language. We have English, we have French, we have other languages. So which would be central? Is that really a priority in our in this conversation at the moment, or there are other bigger fish to fry?
There are bigger things. First, I agree with you. Bigger things. But we have a problem here when it comes to communicating with each other. For example, if I go to Benin, I must have an interpreter a French interpreter. If I go to Cote d'Ivoire, I must have a French interpreter. If a Cote d'Ivoire person, I am more comfortable in Nigeria, for example, and Ghana. When I come from East Africa, from Uganda, I go to those countries. I feel comfortable. I'm talking very comfortably with Felicity. But when you go to a place like Togo, you go to a place like Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, you have a problem. Even in local communication in a hotel, you have a problem. You have to ask somebody, to ask someone, to ask another one. So it becomes a language becomes one of the obstacles that Africa still have to overcome. Two, don't forget another thing. The other thing that is killing us Africans is that we copy what is not workable. There is one thing that has destroyed us, apart from the barrier of customs and so on. One thing that has destroyed us, and it could be a long debate, is our democracy. What type of democracy do you want in Nigeria, for example? What type of democracy does Matsanga want in Uganda? And if we don't sort that out, you can see the type of chaos. Mozambique was a very good country, Felicity. But we have copied a style of democracy where we want to either steal the votes, kill others.
Dr. Matsanga, I know that you and I have had this conversation at some point about the kind of democracy that we want. Maybe a little different from what we have been, shown as what democracy should be. Again, that is a conversation for another day because we're time constrained at the moment. If you could just wrap up with your thoughts, then I do.
On that, it is one of the dividing factors, what we are looking for. What do we want? Unity on African continent, no barriers. If we have bad type of governance, we must go back to our reform. We must go to renaissance. Africa needs a renaissance. Europe, where my brother is, did a renaissance. And it went back and said, why are we like this? China 40 years ago was one of the poorest countries on planet Earth. We've only one rice scheme in my country, sharing with 300 million people. Today, China went back and did away with some obstacles. So Africa needs to go back and do a real surgery of what has happened after 67 years of independence of Ghana getting the first independence.
I will stay with you, Dr. Matsanga. I will stay with you. I mean, you were up for a bit, and we had Dr. Tim hold the fort. I want to talk to you about, I mean, we have to start from somewhere, like you said. And one of the things that's being worked on is visa restriction. You also mentioned earlier the fact that Ghana has opened its borders for other Africans to easily come in. That was a big announcement just days ago. At the current rate of African countries opening up their borders and making it visa-free for other Africans, in the next 5 years, I'm just playing around with the figure perhaps, what do you see in that regard for visa-free Africa?
It is going to come.
That it's something we are promoting.
Dr. Ting, no, hold on. I'm staying with Dr. Matsanga. Sorry. Yeah, I'll come to you in a bit. Okay.
Felicity, a good question. In 5 years to come, I'm telling you the miracle, the dream is coming. Most of these African countries are beginning infrastructure, which Tim has talked about, is started working. If you go in all these countries, in my country, in Kenya, in my country, in so many countries, in Tanzania, in other places, if we remove the wall, roads are being dug, railway is being connected. America has come to invest in the south with another corridor in southern Africa, which takes goods out up to the sea. We are going to, in 5 years, if we work hard, the open visa system will work. Why most countries are worried about the open visa system are people who make crimes, criminals, who move around with drugs, who move around with cocaine, with cannabis, with so many illicit goods that create problems. That's why most of the countries are so worried. But once we remove those barriers, I am telling you, in 5 years, Africa can develop faster. We still have one good thing, the climate. But you see, another thing before I land, you look at what these other Gulf states are doing to us. They have now brought something, I think Tini knows, what they call a credit something, carbon credit. You know, instead of paying for pollution, they are trying to tell us to grow some carbon credit. Countries are coming to buy our spaces for carbon credit, yet they are the polluters. So let's be honest. In 5 years to come, you open the visa, Nigerians can come to Uganda without any hindrance.
All right.
Ugandans can go to Nigeria without any hindrance. How many goods shall we carry into Lagos, into Abuja, into Port Harcourt, into Enugu, Onitsha?
All right, Dr. Matsanga, let's give Dr. Tim some time to also speak on the subject, dreaming a little. I like to dream because some of the biggest accomplishments across the world started with a dream and a desire and an idea. So, Dr. T, I want you to, sorry to backtrack a little. I just wanted to emphasize your comment about one of the biggest challenges has been climate change. And Dr. Matsanga just highlighted that. But back to dreaming again. What are the potential long-term implications of an Africa without borders for the continent's global position and influence?
Well, the link with the diaspora is, of course, essential. We know that when Ghana, a few years ago in 2019, I believe, organized the Year of Return, so many people came back to Ghana, it brought about $2 billion to their economy. Now, we encourage the government of Benin to have a bill about giving citizenship to the historic diaspora. The law was adopted last year. So now we need to organize also a year of return, because people shouldn't return only to Ghana. It has to be everywhere. So you understand, these are the channels and the mechanisms by which we can actually do the Pan-Africanism we're talking about, because Pan-Africanism cannot be pan without, the diaspora, because it means all Africans, Africans from the continent and Africans from the diaspora. These mechanisms are almost in place.
Okay, Dr. Ting, I'm sorry to interject, but I'm looking at Africa-wide, beyond the diaspora. What would an integrated free border movement signify for the continent in global influence?
Well, in global influence, it means that when you have such a strong population and you have a leader speaking on behalf of his population, he is in a better position to negotiate everything. 40 years ago, China was regarded as a third world country. Do you know that they were even receiving aid from Cameroon? Can you imagine? But just because they had one leader, whether it was a democracy or not, people would say, it's China. There are so many people, I need to do business with this guy. And if I have a business with him, I will be, of course, very happy. So this is how, just based on their population, at the beginning, they didn't have any technology. Everybody was complaining they are just imitating other people's technologies. In the past, that was the truth. So, but just based on their population and their governance, they had one leader. That leader was in a position to negotiate good prices, good businesses, etc. Now, when China wants to discuss with Africa, they never discuss with Africa. They would discuss with Mali. They would discuss with Congo. They would discuss with Burundi, etc. So, of course, in that relationship, it's not very favorable for us. So, if we want to have good investment, we need to speak with one voice. At the moment, that is not the case. So we would get better prices, we would get better opportunities, better jobs, etc.
And that's some of the reasons why we have conversations like this, to throw ideas around and see what sticks. Dr. Matsanga, in 40 seconds, if you can, again, how would a borderless Africa impact the continent's global position and influence?
Thank you very much. If we unite as an African continent or as Africans, remove our bad mindset. We have very dangerous mindset. If we look at ourselves as a unique continent, a continent that was created by God uniquely. It is a unique, you look at it, we are surrounded by water. Some people came to us, we didn't go to them. They came to collect us, we did not collect them. If we unite and come back and sit in the continent, we have a lot of mineral resources, we have a lot of everything we have. Remove the wars, remove corruption, remove nepotism, you remove everything and look for one thing, Africa.
All right.
We shall, and our dream will come true, and we shall be the best on international scene. We can't even agree, Felicity, this point, we can't agree even on the seats in the UN Security Council. That's why they degrade us by giving us 2 seats without veto.
Okay, Dr. Matsanga, the director is in my ear saying we have to go. So I must say thank you, as always, for obliging us when we call. We appreciate your time and the insights you provide. And Dr. Ting, it's been an absolute pleasure having you in one slot. Thank you for your time as well.
Very much, Felicity. For me, at least, I'm happy today. I am very, very happy. You don't know. I am now going back to my DRC problem, which I'm handling to make sure.
It's always lovely to have you on, Dr. Matsanga. All right, and that's where we're going to wrap things up today, but not before I reference the author whose publication inspired today's conversation, and that is Tinashe Sithole. He succinctly puts it this way: Pan-Africanism is often used to deflect responsibility for domestic failures while offering superficial solidarity. He went on to say that Without addressing internal governance crisis, structural poverty and ethnic divisions, African states will remain fragmented. My guests also attest to this. If they cannot unite among themselves, how can we hope to unite as a continent? Something for all of us to ponder on. That's it for today. The program returns next week. Bye for now. I'll see you much later.